welcome to this week's episode of Wide Angle. The world is watching with great interest developments in the island nation of the Maldives in the Indian Ocean that declared emergency. President Yamin decided to go ahead with this drastic step after the Supreme Court of the Maldives declared that political prisoners must be released. Now, this development has obviously set alarm bells ringing in many of the Maldives' neighboring nations. Its exiled and ousted President Nasheed has put India in a strange quandary by going public with his demand that India send in troops and intervene militarily to restore what he says is his legitimate government in power. To talk about this and how India will deal with this, former Foreign Secretary Shyam Saran, thank you very much for joining us. Sir, can India go in militarily? That's the question everyone's asking.
Well, I don't think it is so much a question of can India intervene militarily. I think it's more a question of does India wish to intervene, and as you said, should it in such circumstances. So that's a different issue. Let me say, with respect to the statement of former President Nasheed that you referred to, I would say that perhaps by making such a public statement, he has probably made any prospect of intervention by India that much more complicated. Yeah. It would have been preferable if he had not made such a public demand. And also, I think in respect of such interventions, what is very important is the element of surprise, the swiftness with which an intervention takes place. Because there may be arguments about whether or not we should wait and see how the situation evolves before taking such a decision. But in many circumstances, you know, it is the speed with which you intervene that sometimes determines whether or not you achieve your objectives.
Right. So a lot of people who are sort of advocating for some sort of intervention by the Indians are going back to talking about Operation Cactus in 1988, where the legitimate President of the Maldives at the time had invited the Indian government and asked them for help. Here that demand or that request is coming from an exiled opposition leader, not the ruling government.
Well, as
right
I
now
mentioned that precisely for that reason, it has made any such consideration of an intervention option that much more complex. But as far as legitimacy that you are talking about, there are a whole lot of illegitimate things that this president has done.
That's right.
You know, the fact that he has arrested the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court and another justice, leaned upon the remaining judges to, in a sense, reverse the decision that was taken on the opposition leaders. So those cannot be by any stretch of imagination considered to be legitimate political behavior.
Correct.
So one could make out a case for intervention to ensure that constitutionalism comes back to the Maldives. But as I said, I mean, such situations are always very, very complicated. There are so many moving parts in the situation, and any such decision will have a downside, may have a positive side. It's very difficult to even predict what the outcome of such an intervention could be.
We know for the last, 5 years roughly, since 2013 when President Yamin has sort of been in power, the relationship between Male and Delhi has been tenuous and tense. Started with the revocation of a contract for the building of the airport for the Chinese investment in the Maldives. Now we're hearing that the Maldives has sent 3 envoys to what they're calling friendly countries to explain this entire political development. It's unclear whether India is on that list of friendly countries or not, but one of the reports seem to indicate the countries like China, Saudi Arabia, Pakistan. This would be kind of, you know, if India is going to manage the situation, it also has to make sure it doesn't poke the China bear too much as well. How will this work out?
Well, as should be obvious, I mean, the situation today is very different from the last occasion where India intervened militarily. not in terms of capability, as I mentioned, but the
political consideration.
Geopolitical, situation has changed, and China, as you say, has become an important player. It is a very important player already in the Maldives itself. And so you would have seen the statement issued by the Chinese Foreign Ministry.
That's
right. While it has not named India, but it has very clearly signaled that it would oppose any kind of intervention to try and deal with the political situation inside the Maldives. Global Times has actually come out with an article which quite clearly says that India should stay away.
Yeah.
So in that sense, we are facing a more difficult situation. But let me say that in terms of making any kind of decision on this, you have to take into account the fact that, number one, this is a very strategically located island country, just south of India. It is absolutely integral to any kind of Indian Ocean strategy that you wish to pursue. If it does become a kind of a jumping off point for China in the region, it would hugely complicate our security situation.
Right.
So I'm not saying yes, go and intervene, but I think in taking a decision, this backdrop needs to be, always kept in mind, because if the situation goes beyond a certain threshold, reversing it will be that much more difficult. Meaning thereby that if you have Chinese entrenching themselves, like they have been given lease of one of the atolls.
Right, absolutely.
If like Hambantota, it becomes again something which is sold off to a Chinese state company because the Maldives is not able to pay some debt on some other project, you are going to be facing a very, very difficult situation. Your space, strategic space is going to shrink. Therefore, I think in coming to any decision on how we handle this, military option is one option, but there are other options as well. Are we able to, for example, get some other important countries involved in any kind of action with respect to what's happening in the Maldives? We have the Quad now.
Correct, exactly.
You have the Australia, the United States, Japan. Is there something that the four can actually do together in order to try and see how this situation can be dealt?
Right. In fact, that brings me to my next question, because the United States has also issued its travel advisories and raised concerns over these developments in the Maldives. India has chosen to follow that same pattern of the travel advisory. Right now, the Maldives is so
don't forget that even the Chinese have
done the same thing. Absolutely, yes. The Chinese have done the same thing. So that's one sort of soft measure, which is also tough in its own way, because tourism is such a huge part of the Maldivian economy. A travel advisory would certainly put some pressure on industry over there. But you said that, could something be done with the Quad? Could they look at some sort of...
As a possible option.
If you were to sort of hypothesize on what could those options be...
Well, these are four very important countries, and I would imagine that just as our security interests are involved, so are theirs.
Right.
Don't forget that Diego Garcia is not very far away from the Maldives. So, in terms of, having to deal with a situation which could be inimical not only to India's interests, but to the interests of some of the other major powers in the region, this is something which requires perhaps sitting down and thinking about this and see how we can deal with it. Now, I'm not saying that they should together, say, intervene militarily. There may be some diplomatic options. Mention has been made of the fact that this is going to be now considered before the Security Council. Is there some kind of diplomatic pressure which can be brought on the present regime in the Maldives to reverse this situation, to really implement what the Supreme Court has said.
So one of the things, just as somebody who sort of watches foreign policy and watches the theories of realpolitik at play, this Maldives situation has thrown up many interesting questions, especially, you know, in the last 10, 12 years, well, since 2001, actually 16 years, since the war on terror actually began. There's been this argument on what is a Western liberal concept of democracy and what are Eastern concepts, and regimes operate differently, and you may not always like the answers democracy throws up. You hear these debates all the time. This situation in the Maldives, do you think it fits into any part of those conversations and puzzles? I mean, well, how would you...
by any version of democracy that you wish to talk about, this is unconstitutional behavior.
Correct.
So, even if it was not a democratic country in the sense that we talk about, the fact is that you have a president who is flouting a decision taken by an institution which is recognized in the constitution of that country.
Right.
Whether it is a democracy or not.
Correct, fair enough.
So, it's a question of respecting the rule of law, respecting institution which everyone has recognized as having a legitimate place in that political or governance structure. So I would not like to get into that argument.
Correct. Okay.
The fact is that here you have a government, and if we use the realpolitik argument from India's perspective, for the reasons that I mentioned, your security interests are under threat.
Right. Absolutely.
There is no doubt about that. So I would not necessarily bring in the democracy or no democracy argument.
Just keep it simple, basically.
It is something which could gravely complicate your maritime strategy, and you have to look at what the implications could be. You see, I have spoken about, say, what the Chinese have done in the South China Sea.
Right.
You know, what do? You start off with small steps. Each step is not big enough to invite a reaction. But cumulatively over a period of time, a series of steps creates a change in the facts on the ground. And then it becomes very difficult to reverse that or to deal with that.
Right.
So here also my plea is that we should look at what could happen going forward if this situation is not addressed. Not only because, oh, this man is pro-Chinese, but he may have put himself in a position where it may be very difficult for him to resist going forward demands that may be made.
So, sir, in a sense, even though Nasheed may have put India in a quandary in terms of how to respond publicly to this, the facts, as you point out, also bear themselves out that this is a geostrategic situation that we are finding ourselves in right now. It needs to be addressed by New Delhi. The other argument that one has heard for the last few years in the Maldives is also sort of in terms of the radicalization argument. There are concerns about what's going on in the Maldives. So, whichever way you sort of slice and dice it, there is an argument being made for India to go in.
So, argument being made to India that it needs to deal with this situation. Now, the military response is not the only response.
What other things could
Well, as I mentioned to you, I mean, is it possible for other major countries who also have important stakes in this particular part of the world, are they prepared to work together? Are they prepared to, for example, work together through the United Nations? You know, what kind of pressures can we bring to bear on this? You know, people have talked about sanctions. People have talked about, you know, even I saw a report that India may be asking Saudi Arabia to use its influence over Yemen to try and reverse the situation. So there are, I think there may be some balls in play which are not visible to us. I'm sure that this government is very much aware of the implications that I mentioned, but I don't think we should make the mistake of thinking it's a question of do we go in or do we not go in. You know, it's not as simple as that.
Right.
Any military intervention has to take into account very carefully what the possible consequences could be. Because the morning after is also very important, in terms of, taking any such decision.
And traditionally, India has been very cautious before taking any steps towards military intervention.
Yes.
I mean,
and rightly so, rightly so, for the reasons that I mentioned. So, it needs to be a mix of different, sort of responses.
Also, sir, one question. Whenever India has acted or intervened militarily in the past, it's been restricted to the immediate region and sort of the geopolitical, region of geopolitical influence. We've been seeing periodic demands for India to, send boots on the ground in other wars and other conflicts in other parts of the world. How does a foreign policy thinker such as you balance those different pulls and pressures and arguments when there is a clear need for some action and some balls to be in play here?
The bottom line is, do you have the resources to be able to carry something like this out? Secondly, you have to take into account, is this a short, swift operation? Like it happened in 1998, you went in, you secured the place and
you came out.
In another case, that did not happen. With the IPKF in Sri Lanka, it did not happen. So we should not blunder into that kind of a situation. So I am not saying that there is a blanket sort of, no intervention or no boots on the ground. There may be occasions where very, very vital Indian interests are involved, and that may be the only way to secure your interests, particularly, as you mentioned, in the neighborhood. And that is what has happened in the past.
In terms of priority, that
exactly.
Would be
I mean, like Mrs. Gandhi's, for example, assistance to Nevin to UNU in Myanmar, or in Sri Lanka when the JVP the insurgency came up. So there have been those instances where clearly India has felt that on balance,
it is in Indian national
interest to do it, and we have the capability to carry it through. So in this case also, you would have to make a similar calculation. I don't think that we should look at this as something, that India being now a major power should demonstrate this by, willingness to intervene more than in the past. I don't think we should use that metric to determine whether or not.
Because the ones who are calling or advocating for it are demanding the sort of show of muscularity.
No, I don't think we should do this kind of show of muscularity, because sometimes that pushes you into a corner.
Coming back will be difficult.
You become a prisoner of your own rhetoric. So I would not certainly go in that direction. So coming back to the Maldives, as I said, there is no doubt in my mind that what happens in Maldives will have a very major impact on India's maritime security. No doubt about that. And therefore, whatever we do has to be against that backdrop. There is no doubt in my mind that if there is, as a result of what is happening, as a result of what has happened so far, if you are going to have a Chinese presence, a strong Chinese presence entrenched in this island chain, it will gravely restrict, constrain your security choices.
Right. So the MEA issued a statement essentially saying they were watching and they were disturbed by the developments in the Maldives. It was a show of concern and yet not an alarming statement. One expects India to be disturbed by these developments. He said the emergency is about 15 days is the term that he had given. We're already a few days into that. The Maldives is sending out envoys. Do you think that, is time of the essence right now, even as India weighs its options about what it can do? Do we wait till the 15 days is over?
A very difficult, decision on that count. The reason why I worry a little more is precisely because we may be getting into a situation For example, if we go through the diplomatic front,
right? Okay.
Say at the United Nations, what will China's attitude be? Say in the Security Council, if some resolution comes up, condemning. In
fact, there are reports of the UN meeting on this in the next 2 days.
We should be conscious of the fact that you may get blocked by China in any kind of a diplomatic, response that you may try to construct. So there are various kinds of scenarios that you have to take into account before you go in a certain direction. So don't forget that today China is in a position, at least diplomatically, to provide the kind of shield that Yamin may be looking for. Now, in providing that shield, China may demand even more concessions. After all, this is what has happened in the past, say with Myanmar.
Right.
When Myanmar was isolated, when it was being, isolated in the United Nations, for example, it was also an opportunity for China, which it leveraged, very skillfully. So we should be conscious of that as well, that we don't get into a situation where our attempt to try and isolate the Maldives
pushes them closer to
pushes
China.
them in a, not necessarily by choice, but by compulsion, in a situation where their vulnerability to Chinese demands, especially for, say, some kind of a security presence, that vulnerability increases. We are not so much worried about Yamin as such, but we are worried about what the current developments may mean in terms of India's own interests. That should be the guiding principle.
Right, Mr. Saran, thanks so much for speaking to Wide Angle, because as we pointed out right in the beginning, given the presence of the Maldives in India's direct neighborhood, its strategic significance, old ties, we are all members of the SAARC regional grouping as well. I think everyone's watching Delhi right now to see what the lead should be on the Maldives.
Not a very enviable situation, but I have confidence in our colleagues in the Foreign Ministry to deal with
And I think the challenge is not to let any political rhetoric kind of get in the way of any decision making over here.
We should not. I mean, whether in terms of muscularity or whether in terms of, we should be hands off, I think we should deal with it in a sober, in a calm manner, taking into account, as I said, the factors which are important in terms of safeguarding India's interest. That is the bottom line as far as I'm concerned.
Thank you so much for speaking to us, Shyam Saran. Thank you.